Hello, and welcome to another edition of Coffee with Comrades, a podcast discussing current events, theory, and action through a radical lens. Holy shit, we made it. We did it. We did the thing. 100 episodes of Coffee with Comrades. Really, it's more than that with all the bonus episodes and whatnot, but still, it's an accomplishment. Nonetheless, I'm going to own it. 100 episodes. Wild. Regardless of whether you've been here since day one or this is your very first time checking out Coffee with Comrades, thank you from the bottom of my heart for being here. Big shout out in particular to all of those who sent in questions for this episode's Q&A. We got a jam-packed episode for you today, folks, including a conversation with my pal Abdul about the NBA Wildcat Strike. But before we get there, check out this jingle from our comrades on the Channel Zero network.
You're listening to Dissident Island Radio.
Live every first and third Friday of the month at 9 p.m. GMT.
Check out www.dissidentisland.org for downloads and more.
We are, as always, enormously proud to be part of the Rev Left Radio Federation and the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts. If you dig this show, you can support our work by going to www.patreon.com/coffeewithcomrades to become a monthly sustainer for as little as $1 a month. Thanks to our patrons, we've been able to continue churning out episodes every single week for you to enjoy. We sincerely appreciate your contributions to this program. It means the fucking world. Alright, with that all said and done, let's check in with Abdul and find out more about the NBA Wildcat Strikes.
I wrote this to start a fire. I wrote this in memory of Hannah Higher. Fire starter, throwing kerosene on the coals. For the white rose, rest in peace to Sophie Show. This for liberatic, who fight against the fascists. The idolized pirate said, take this day to smash it. The swing kids as I zoom and suit jackets, along with the slurs who wanted Nazis and trash pits. I wrote this for Emma, who lit my soul's inner flame. This is for Ida, who taught us how to liberate. 43 group in the battle of Cable Street, who fought fascists in London, blood left their faces street. We rock against racism like the X-ray specs. We're looking for liberation, not paychecks. From Charlottesville to the Valley of Harama, I thought Killjoy told you there's no Nazis in Valhalla.
We never think about Heather but when we laugh or smile, because she often made people laugh. We love the sound of her laugh. A lot of us have videotapes.
We don't all have to sacrifice our lives. They tried to kill my child to shut her up. Well, guess what? You just magnified her.
Generally, it's a clusterfuck. I hope that it gets better soon, but who's to fucking say?
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's like, it does feel bad, and like I know you're not supposed to feel guilty about this, but there's like so many good things happening in my like personal private life. Totally. You know, like my partner and I are in a good place. Like, you know, I've got an offer from an agent, like all the stuff I just told you about, right? I can't talk about publicly. Right. But at the same time, it's like, oh, the world is literally collapsing around me, right? It's like
it's falling down around our ears.
There's some really rad stuff happening in Edmonton, though, which I'm looking to move out of Edmonton. But there's a camp that's been set up called Pekawewin, which is an amazing like homeless, unhoused persons camp run by BLM and Indigenous people, and that's so rad. It has grown now. It has taken up most of the riverfront, and it is enormous, and it is well funded, and they have like social workers there, crisis intervention people, like
wow,
they have like 30-40 people at any given time at the camp, right? And and they're expecting to keep it going through like a negative 40-degree winter, which is
that
awesome.
Fucking rules, dude. That's insane. Hey, I'm curious. I know this is totally off topic, but since you brought it up, I'm actually kind of curious. You know, obviously I know that from listening to things about the Wet'suwet'en camp and talking with folks like Mexi, who are from Canada. I know that Indigenous struggles and decolonization is an ongoing thing in Canada. But does Black Lives Matter have a large presence there? I think I almost always think of Black Lives Matter as a predominantly U.S. centric kind of like imperial core kind of organizing. Does that happen a lot in Canada?
There are Black Lives Matter chapters in Canada, and rightly so. Right, obviously it's a settler colonial state, but they're less politically powerful, I would say, than the ones in the U.S. Most of them, I don't think, are affiliated with Black Lives Matter U.S. and the way the organizational structure of BLM, like the U.S. BLM, functions. At the same time, like Canada, Atlantic Canada has, especially, but the entire country has like a deep history of anti-Black racism, right? Like, you think of Africville, which was a Black community in Nova Scotia that was bulldozed completely, right? And all their shit was burned and thrown out, and they were forcibly displaced, or like, stuff like that. Toronto obviously has big issues with carding and like, police violence. Even like Edmonton and the Somali community in particular here has been extremely hard done by police. So, I mean, it exists. I would say that the crux of Canada's social justice issues does hinge largely on Indigenous people, and for good reason. But BLM and Indigenous solidarity movements are enmeshed here in a very like keen and specific way.
Totally, yeah, and that's definitely the same here in the U.S. as well. I mean, I think the struggle of decolonization and the anti-racist struggle against white supremacy are necessarily intertwined. Well, that's really cool. I had never like made that connection like cognizantly before. I mean, it makes sense because, like you said, Canada is a settler colonialist state, but it's still fascinating nonetheless. So thank you for telling me about that, Abdul. I appreciate you. Well, listen, welcome on the pod yet again. Is this your third time on Coffee with Comrades?
Third time, but first time as a de facto guest and not a crossover.
True. This is true. Well, welcome, Abdul, Socialist Raptor Online. It's a pleasure to have you on the pod. And it's fitting. Speaking of your screen name, it's fitting because we're gonna be talking about the NBA. What is it? Strike, boycott? We're gonna talk about it.
It's a strike.
So let's dig into it a little bit. It's a strike. Spoiler alert! It's definitely a fucking strike.
Yeah, 100%.
100%. It is a Wildcat Strike, and everyone else who says otherwise is wrong, and we're going to say why, but we'll get there. So for folks who've been totally living under a rock or haven't been on social media and haven't heard about the NBA Wildcat Strike, walk us through what happened.
Okay, I think it's important to know the context as well. Not just of the last couple of weeks, but even before that, right? So, like, NBA stoppage was probably, I would say, the time where North America realized that COVID was real. Yeah, I mean, like, that's the time where people, oh shit, this is like a thing that we should be scared of, right? That sort of, I would argue, that plus Tom Hanks is what really like catapulted COVID to like a legitimate threat in the public imagination. Sure. And the NDP then decided to restart play a couple of months later in a very tightly controlled bubble system in Orlando, Florida, right?
So tell me about that. What does that look like?
It means that the players stay there. They quarantine for 2 weeks before they can play. They're not allowed to leave. If they do leave, they have to come back and quarantine for 2 weeks. There's daily or every other day COVID tests. You're not allowed to see your family. A lot of workers, and of course the workers, within this who work in Orlando and do the service stuff are separated from the players with shields. I'm not super clear on the details of how many workers have to live in Orlando. And it's only just now, like more than a month after the bubble started, that families are being allowed into the bubble. So players, and a lot of them are young, right? Obviously, like average, you age out of the NBA usually by the time you're like 36, 37, if you're lucky. So a lot of these players are finally having their families in the bubble and stuff like that they've been away from for a really long time. And you play on 2 courts. And yeah, they decided to restart playing a bubble system. However, the bubble started around the time of the George Floyd protests. And, the NBA being a predominantly black league, there's obviously some consternation about this. So Union VP Kyrie Irving said that they shouldn't play. People clowned on him a lot because Kyrie wasn't playing in the playoffs, and they said, "Oh, he just doesn't want other people to play." You know, classic strike breaking, like optics, media bullshit, right?
Right.
Totally. And players expressed valid concern. There were union meetings. There were a lot of them where hundreds of players came onto Zoom calls and talked about their concerns, and the NBA said, okay, you know what, we'll listen to your concerns. We'll have the Black Lives Matter on the court. We'll center, Black stories. We'll run segments dedicated to, why Black Lives Matter and like highlighting, justice and stuff like that. And you can select from one of 20 pre-selected justice messages to put on your jersey, right?
That's so fucking Orwellian. Okay, so let me get this straight, because frankly, and you know this, but for listeners who aren't aware, I don't really follow sports. So they tell all these folks that they have to go live in a bubble. This predominantly black professional athletes league, that they all have to go live in this bubble, and they have to play sports to titillate and entertain white America. And when they say that they are outraged justly over the killings of George Floyd and so many others at the hands of the police, they are told that they have 20 pre-approved fucking messages that they can put on their
including
jerseys.
Stuff like education reform, vote, and equality.
Wow.
And like some players just didn't want to wear anything on their jersey, not their name, not a tag, just have a blank jersey with their number. They were told they wouldn't be allowed to play if they did that. A lot of players were angry because Norman Powell from the Toronto Raptors wanted to put "MI Next" on his jersey, and they wouldn't let him. Right? And like it's stuff like that where it's like, and they were told there would be no penalty if you didn't play. I think that's also important to mention, is people were told if you don't want to play, there's nothing there. But of course, like that, there's a degree of social pressure, of economic pressure, of not
100%.
getting paid, right? Like you're not gonna. Very few players took them up on that offer because it's like, well, we're so close. We've played 50 games this season already or whatever, and I don't know the exact amount of games, but like why would we pass up this chance of everyone else we know is going, right? It's a very like normal thing. It's also worth mentioning that under pro sports, athletes are not allowed to strike. I think that's important to mention within this. The first one of the major things in every sports CBA is that you can't strike. That's why you always hear about the NHL lockout or the NFL lockout or the NBA lockout, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I know it's the first thing in my CBA.
Is that you can't strike? Really?
Yeah, the very first thing.
This is one of those things where it's like, yeah, Canada sucks. It's fake. It's a settler state. But like, I'm pretty sure striking is enshrined under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and has been upheld by the Supreme Court like several times.
That rules.
Unless you're an essential worker, in which case, you cannot. But
Abdul, you're aware that I'm from Florida, right?
Yes.
The actual armpit, flaccid cock of the entire
Orlando, in
planet.
fact. You're just
I
a
am,
couple
in fact, from Orlando.
miles separated from the best and the brightest of the NBA.
Oh, man. Well, tell me a little bit about the culture of the NBA. Like, what makes this sports league in particular a powder keg for organized labor and anti-racist action?
A couple of things. I think the first one is the sport is majority black. That's just a fact. That's just something you have to get out of the way. It is a sport dominated by black players. It has historically, the evolution of the game ties very deeply into a form of expression and justice and, gamesmanship for black communities. I think that is like, it's such a vital thing when you think specifically about basketball, right? And it's like, stuff like, dunking, which white owners tried to make illegal in the game and stuff like that, right? Like specific ways the games were played to like appeal more to white people, and there were big questions in the 70s and 80s. Is the game becoming too black, right? Are white people being pushed out of the game? And it's like, it's got a very historical level of like race and racism attached to it. The NBA also fields one of the smallest total rosters of players, which I think makes it easier to organize. They have one of the strongest unions. They have the best pension. The last time the NBA went on strike, which was 1964, it was only 24 players, but no, it was 30 players, sorry. They went on a 2-hour Wildcat that resulted in them getting the first ever pension in professional sports. And it's still the best pension in the game, so they've got a...
Direct action gets the motherfucking goods,
Well,
y'all.
like, the story of that is super fucking interesting, because, like, you know, that was the 1964 All-Star Game was the first televised All-Star Game, and the entire TV deal that is the backbone of the NBA's money today rode on that game going well and getting good ratings, and the owners had stalled out. They call them the governors now, because owners is a, you know, obviously racist term in this context. But the owners had stalled out negotiating a pension, right? And the players, 2 hours before the All-Star Game, they knew what was on the line if this All-Star Game did not happen on television, right? And they went on strike, and they said, we're not going to play until you give us a fucking pension. And these are... I'm pretty sure almost every player in the 1964 All-Star Game is a Hall of Famer. Like, these are some of the best to ever play the game. And they went on strike, and they won their pension, and they won the first pension in pro sports. And it's like, that's
so fucking sick.
Yeah, and that's awesome, right? And, like, Bill Russell, who was part of that strike, was a key figure in the civil rights movement. He was, you know, a black athlete in Boston who played and won 11 championships, even though his house was being broken into and people were, like, smearing shit on the walls, right? Trying to run him out of town. You know, and the FBI had a fucking file on this guy that was, you know, as thick as your thumb, right? So it's like, not only that, but also basketball is a star-dominated league. It's a very person-dominated league. There's no pads in basketball. The fans sit so close to the game. I mean, not anymore, but you get what I'm saying. Like, the game has an implicit understanding that without those stars, without those players, like, they really run the organization. They have the biggest reach. People feel an intensely parasocial relationship to these players because you're seeing them so close. You're not seeing them with a helmet. You're not seeing them bulked up in football pads, right? Like, it is so dependent on the personalities that drive it. And, like, the league has had a history of racist shit within it, right? From dunking to, you know, the shut up and dribble thing that, you know, a Fox News announcer told LeBron. That was a huge one. And stuff like that. You know, Donald Sterling, famous former owner of the Clippers, used to parade his players around at something called white parties. Like they were, you know, like they were on a fucking auction block, and
Jesus fuck.
He lost control of the team when he lost control of the team when there was audio that came out of him getting mad at his mistress for palling around with black players, right? And so it's stuff like that like really informs the social justice culture of the NBA. And, you know, a lot of these players have experienced racism. You know what I mean? Your odds of getting into the NBA are lower than your odds of winning the lottery in America. And for a lot of people, you know, you watch Hoop Dreams or something like that. Like, a lot of people in low-income communities, you think this is your only way out. When you've made it, you really do make it, right? You're one of the very few lucky ones who can play in the NBA. That's huge. But a lot of these players come from circumstances where they've experienced oppression at the hands of police, right? Or systemic injustice at the hands of just, I don't know, fucking capitalism as an abstract, right? And even though they might not have the political language to articulate it, I think it's still, you know, something that's just naturally understood by people who've grown up, you know, under the worst capitalism can offer.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. I mean, it's also interesting thinking about sort of some of those concessions that the NBA offered to players, and how sort of tepid they were. Because in your article for Organizing Work, you talk about some of these meek concessions that were meted out by management. And I was wondering if you maybe talk a little bit more about the performative wokeness of their posturing and some of the players, like how it proved insufficient for them. You mentioned it a little bit earlier, you know, about how players wanted to wear jerseys without votes or
equality,
education reform or equality on their jerseys. You know, what were some of the other gestures that management tried to mete out to players, and why did those prove to be not enough to pacify the players in the NBA.
By the way, very quickly, Spencer Dinwiddie, who ended up not playing because he got COVID, wanted to put deficit on his jersey, he's a white player, by the way, of course. But like, he was a big Bitcoin guy as well. But yeah, like, I think for a lot of players, and you know, before the bubble started, there was a lot of footage of certain players at the protests, at the George Floyd protests, you know, using their platform to speak into a megaphone. It's like, dude, you're going to go play basketball, and we're going to distract people from this, like, these core issues that are being challenged on the streets of America, right? Like, obviously...
Bread and circuses.
Yeah, obviously that sits really unwell with people, and, like, I'm of the opinion that, like, you know, bread and circuses is true to an extent, but, like, you know, there's a great book I'll never not hesitate to recommend called The Power and The Game Is Not a Game, The Power and Politics of American Sport by Robert Scoop Jackson, where he talks about how sports are the place in which power is articulated in America, which I think is a really interesting take. And he said, it talks about Muhammad Ali and the you know, the famous Olympic Black Power salute and basketball and stuff like that, right? And the gentrification of sport. But you know, it's impossible for the NBA to support something like that by its very nature, right? It is, especially if it's endorsing it. It's like your boss is endorsing it, right? Like, of course it feels hollow. And, like, you know, there's a lot of discomfort around that, especially as things escalated. And then, you know, the George Floyd protests cooled off a bit. You know, the media stopped covering it, and things seemed to be progressing as the league intended. And then Jacob Blake happened, right? And Jacob Blake was the fucking powder keg because... And this is where social media is great, because all these players, a lot of them have had vlogs in the bubble and stuff like that, and you've been getting insights into conversations that they've been having one-on-ones informally about social justice and stuff like that. And a lot of it is vote because that's what people have been told, right? Like, a lot of it is vote because that's the paradigm that's articulated in American education around, you know, what justice means. But a lot of it is like, you know, even it doesn't matter who we vote for, they're going to kill us anyway, right? And when this happened, the players, you know, decided, you know what, like, the Raptors basically posited first that they were considering a strike of their first game against the Celtics, which, you know, people picked up on, stuff like that, and they said they were holding players meetings to talk about it and stuff like that. But then the Milwaukee Bucks just didn't show up to their game. Before the Celtics-Raptors game could happen, the Milwaukee Bucks were like, we're just not going to show up. We're just not going to tell anyone. We're going to meet in our locker room for 2 hours and talk about this. And finally, we decided not to show up, right? Unprecedented.
That video is fucking awesome.
Yeah, it's so good. And no one was told, right? No one was told. And this is important because Milwaukee, Wisconsin, obviously, right? But two members on the Bucks have experienced police violence firsthand. In fact, one of them was savagely beaten by police in I believe it was like a McDonald's or a Wendy's parking lot, right? 2 years ago? Or some years ago, I think it was 2. But yeah, like so they not only have this like understanding of, okay, you know, shit is happening and we can't entertain people right now, but also like this hits home for us, right? And of course, it goes back to Kaepernick. That was the other thing the NBA did, concessions, was allowing kneeling at games, right? And stuff like that, which is like, sure, you know what I mean? Like, it makes a statement, I guess, right? But like... Well,
it's funny you mentioned that because the strike happened 4 years to the day, right? Since Kaepernick first took a knee during the national anthem as a gesture of solidarity with Black Lives Matter. In your article, you stressed that successful labor organizing takes time. So let's get into the nitty gritty of this. Now that we've kind of set the stage for like what the NBA and its culture for folks who aren't aware, let's kind of zoom in a little bit on labor and thinking about how labor specifically flexes and expresses itself in the NBA. So how did the 4 years since Cap's taking a knee shape this particular moment? How did that lay the kind of the groundwork for it? Because a lot of people are new to politics, Abdul, and may not necessarily remember or might vaguely remember, right, Cap taking a knee, but not in the same kind of potent way that they did, like people got into politics post-Trump. So can you walk us through like that kind of like time scale of how, how much professional sports and professional athletes have had a voice at the table in matters of both labor and anti-racist action?
Yeah, I think that there's a couple, there's a lot to touch on there. Historically, and especially in the last couple of years, the NBA is loosely defined by eras, right? There's a Showtime era Lakers, there's a big man era, there's a three-point era. But, in a lot of places, this current era is called the player empowerment era, right? Players aren't expected to stay with one team. They can go with whoever offers them the best deal. They can, they hold more cards than the owners, right? And that comes up in CBA negotiations a lot, which another one is beginning pretty soon because there's a mutual opt-out clause in the CBA for, I think, 22-23. So, players, and I think it's easy to forget, Kaepernick wasn't the first to kneel. Mohamed Abdul Rauf was in the NBA years before, right? 1996. And they suspended him for his refusal to stand. In fact, there is a pretty good argument to be made that Mohamed Abdul Rauf, did not have a pretty, effective career after that, specifically because he didn't stand for the anthem, right?
Right.
He's traded to Vancouver and then washed out of the league, less than 2 years after that. And, before that, there were other players, right? But Kaepernick, broke open a conversation, especially in football, that needed to happen because football is the definition of a plantation sport, right? And I love football. I don't really know the mechanics of it super well, but I love watching it. I love the stories, that I read about football. I love following, the team storylines more than I like actually hard watching every game and analyzing the plays. But that was a strong stance to make, and a lot of people see it as tokenistic or something, but the sports dictates the culture. How did that open up a much more popular conversation? How did it move Black Lives Matter into conversation that didn't just happen in black-led spaces, but that happened in white-dominated and white liberal spaces as well, right?
Totally.
And also did a lot to articulate the racist underbelly of American sport, which both with the fans and the owners, I think, to a large extent does exist. And so beyond that, we all saw what happened to Kaepernick, right? And it's not like the NBA wasn't paying attention. That came alongside, LeBron James being told to shut up and dribble by a host on Fox News. And issues of police violence only became larger over time and sort of more, well, not larger over time, but more amplified, right? Especially in our current paradigm. And for a lot of players who have been told, in no uncertain terms to shut up and dribble, I think it activated a lot of people to be like, oh no, I can do something, right? I have this big platform, I have this big stage, literally the biggest stage in the world to voice my concerns and speak out for justice, right? And then that paired with the fact that we are in an era of player empowerment, that we are in an era where players are, paid really well. And you can't discount the WNBA here too, right? Who just negotiated a fucking ballin' contract where they tripled their pay, got mat leave.
Holy shit, did they really?
Yeah, they tripled their pay, got mat leave, got free child care, negotiated a bunch of stuff in the contract that relates to base pay as well. And stuff like that, right? And the WNBA, in a lot of ways, has also led the charge. It's not just the NBA. It's important to consider the WNBA in this as well, right? And their labor organizing is absolutely phenomenal, and stuff like that. So it's and they're in a great bargaining position because the WNBA loses money, but the WNBA cannot, which is funded in part by the NBA, cannot cope with the fallout of shutting down the WNBA. So they can keep pushing for this stuff because lose money, who gives a shit? They have all the money in the world, right? And so they're in a great bargaining position as well. So I mean, yeah, it's those two things together, I think, combined to form a really strong basis from which something like this could happen. I think that there were a lot of conversations happening in this space. I think that as more players became politically active and you saw them more on streets and stuff like that, you saw this stuff spread from league to league. it really opened the door. And I don't think you can really separate anti-black racism and labor organizing in this case, because sports is a system largely of white owners and black players, right? It's as much a labor issue as it is a racism issue.
100%. 100%. I'm curious, as the strike kicked off, management rushed to call this a boycott. And NBA boycott was even a trending hashtag on Twitter for a while there. Why is this not a boycott? We joked about it earlier. Why is this not a boycott?
Because a boycott, I think, implies an optional, non-participation in something, right? I boycott Israel by choosing not to buy products made in Israel or travel to Israel, right?
Right. The BDS. You're referring, of course, to the BDS.
Yeah,
movement. Absolutely.
Or Turkey, for that matter. I'm a big fan of BDS Turkey as well. So it's like, that is a choice to not participate. When you don't walk onto the job, when you are expected to show up for a job and you do not do it, you are withholding your labor. And when you do that collectively, that is a fucking strike, right? It's not like they had the choice.
By definition.
Yeah.
It's not a consumer choice. It's a worker choice.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not, and like even consumer choice also applies to experiences, right? Like, I bought tickets to some artist, and I found out that artist's racist, and I just chose not to show up to the concert. That's a boycott, right? But you're not getting paid for to showing up for that concert. These guys are getting paid per game to fucking play. And I think that is deeply important when you consider the difference between a boycott and a strike. It's not like the NBA was like, yeah, come down to the court and play if you want, guys. You know what I mean? Like, it's open for you. Yeah, we might throw it on TV. It's like, no, of course, they're workers. They're paid to be there, right? So when you collectively don't show up, and I would understand, like the boycott thing a little more if it was one player, right? Maybe if it was one player, like I would get it, because it's like you're not collectively organizing. It's like a one-man strike, right? Like, or just chooses to not participate. But like collectively, when people do this, it's a fucking strike. There's no other way to put it. But of course, like, what's the one thing? What's the one thing bosses hate, right? It's the idea of strikes being catapulted into the public imagination. And this is the largest Wildcat strike, I think, from like an optics perspective in years, right? Or this was
100%.
And that, yeah.
I mean, at least in recent memory, the only one that I can think of that comes to mind is the Wildcat strike of Virginia teachers that kicked off. Was it 2-3 years ago? But I've also, speaking of not just managers trying to call it a boycott, I've also seen a lot of very online leftists opine that the player's choice to walk off the job was not actually a Wildcat strike, and I was wondering if I could get your thoughts on that.
What was their justification for that? I haven't seen a ton of this.
That just, people saying, well, it's not a strike, it's not a Wildcat strike, they're just withholding their labor.
By definition, the withhold, as someone who works for a labor union, you know what I mean?
Right,
like,
exactly.
Yeah, by definition,
exactly.
The withholding of your labor collectively is a strike, right? Like,
especially when you're not allowed to strike in your fucking contract.
Yeah, in your CBA, when the CBA says you show up and fucking play, right? Like you don't do that as a team. You have a conversation based on months and years of other conversations that lead to you not showing up for the job. Like, and I get it. I actually do get this reactionary tendency in online leftists. Like, it makes sense. I disagree with it. I think it's awful, and like I'm very happy to deconstruct it, right? But like, there's no way this wasn't a Wildcat strike. By definition, by example, by historical precedent in labor action in sports, this is a Wildcat, right? Now, players choose to boycott the anthem, right? They're not striking from the anthem. They're not getting paid to show up and stand for the anthem, right? Like Kaepernick, boycotted the anthem. Players do that sometimes. They just don't show up and then show up on the court after the anthem's over or whatever for the the shoot around or the tip off. But like, yeah, no, I think that this sort of reaction really downplays the role of sports in shaping our political discourse, particularly since we are like very online leftists, right? Like we tend to not again, it's that organizing adage: if you got to meet people where they're at, not where you want them to be. And I think this is very demonstrative of that. People who get angry at what happened with the strike are very pissed off about that, right?
Yeah.
But
Totally.
they don't get like what good organizing is, which is like, people will have an instinct to understand injustice and will act on that injustice in the way that they understand they're capable of, right? And the role of you as an organizer is to expand their horizons, to show they're capable of everything, right? They're owed the world because they're workers.
Beautifully said, my friend. Beautifully said. Well, speaking of trying to meet people where they're at, one of the lines that conservative commentators or Fox News consumers love to regurgitate and repeat ad nauseum is that athletes get paid a fortune and that they should just shut up and dribble, as we have been talking about. And, of course, they've been saying this for decades. They said it about Muhammad Ali. They said it about the three folks who held up the Black Power fist at the Olympics, and it really featured a fever pitch in recent memory with Kaepernick. And I'm curious, again, your response and why this is a bad faith argument and how you tend to reply to people like that when you get into those sorts of conversations.
I think there's a couple of things worth considering within this bad faith argument, right? One is that workers are perpetually at the mercy of management. They are traded, they are, subject to whatever clauses, they are fined by the league, they have to operate under a certain set of circumstances. There's a fucking dress code, right? And yeah, players are paid a fortune. That's not like an inarguable thing.
That's not up for debate.
But I mean, relative to the value of what the owners generate or extract from their labor, they're not, right?
No, totally.
And it's worth recognizing that, in a worker paradigm, this is why I hate arguments about the professional managerial class not being workers, right? PMC are well compensated, but relative to the value they generate for their employer, they are not. They are lumpen to some degree. I think you can make that argument, but the paradigm should always be worker boss, right? And everything within that.
That's an interesting vector. I haven't considered that before. I'm not sure if I entirely agree with you on that one, my friend. Can you say more about that? Because it seems like I can see that I could see an argument of divide and conquer, but I'm curious, bosses trying to divide and conquer by having this middle management, but are they not then betraying the working class and are they not
I guess when I say
benefiting from sort of petty bourgeois kind of positioning or as you say a lumpen proletariat positioning?
I guess when I say the PMC, I should just say the PC, right? The professional class. I think the managerial class is, again, I'm very essentialist about this paradigm of it's workers and bosses, right? And if you have the power to hire and fire someone, if you extract surplus value from their labor, and they don't get it, you're a boss, right? Right. For me, it's if you're a member of the professional class and you're reactionary, big Kamala K-Hive person or whatever, ultimately you're I'm not going to call you a class traitor. Ultimately, you're a reactionary outcropping of, I think, a leftist failure to organize, and I think it ultimately funnels down to the fact that the paradigm of what is working class has shifted, and I think a lot of leftist rhetoric hasn't caught up to that yet, right? And it's fed by a media culture that positions poverty and reactionary tendency and performative wokeness as being, positive things and stuff like that, right?
Totally. That's interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting kind of vector of analysis that I have never considered before. I am also curious though, because you mentioned it briefly. I wanted to ask you about the analysis of the pay discrepancy that you write about in the article, right? Because again, not to beat a dead horse, a lot of folks will say that players who, for the record, right, are world-class athletes are paid millions of dollars and they're not really working class. And it sounds like, you're making the argument that, well, they may be paid a lot of money, but they are still workers, and I'm sympathetic to that argument, and I'm kind of curious about how if you could talk a little bit about the pay gap between players and owners in the NBA or in professional sports generally?
It varies from sport to sport. I think that's worth mentioning. Like the NBA has a salary cap per team. The MLB doesn't have a cap on what players can get paid, for example, right? I don't know much about European sports. The paradigm is different. I'm not going to touch it, period, because I genuinely do not know. I can speak to the major American sports leagues. But something to keep in mind is that you go into this, largely you don't have a degree. You come into it either playing 2 years of college or playing overseas for a bit, and you're 17, 18, and you've been gifted, with extraordinary skills, and that you've worked very hard to develop, and then you go into a league. Average washout time in the NBA, 4 to 5 years max? So already you're getting what you're looking at largely as a system of insurance. You're getting paid a lot up front for the fact that you've resigned yourself to a life afterwards that may not have many opportunities for you, right? With the NFL, it's even more pronounced because NFL has a history, obviously, of CTE and chronic illness. I think for a long time, a majority of NFL players, who are in those specifically physical positions, wouldn't make it more than 10 years after retirement, right? They would just die because of chronic head injury, right? And the NFL does not have a pension plan. Well, it does. The pension plan is let me just check. Players are fully vested in the plan after 3 years, and the pension benefit is $43,000 a year. They have the worst pension plan in professional sports, barely a pension plan, right?
Right.
And so, yeah, sure, they're extremely economically privileged. Don't get me wrong, right? Rookie salary in the NBA is $738,000, I believe, right? That's a lot of money. As a fraction of owners' money, nothing. You know what I mean?
Totally.
But also, you're also getting paid this much to a high degree as insurance for the fact that you're playing a physical sport at the highest level that will destroy your body without any educational, professional opportunities after that, right? For every, and it's also worth mentioning, most players aren't LeBron James or Shaq, right? Most players are not these superstars who get the big endorsement deals, who get to have a whole cadre of managers and people who work for them to make sure that they're seeing the best light and go do ads for Inkjet or whatever, right?
Right.
Most players, averaged out, the average salary veers towards the lower rather than the higher, right? Most teams have one player that's paid $30 million or two players that are paid that much, but and it is a lot of money, but again, you really do have to look at it in the dynamic of bosses and workers, right? You really do have to look at it in the dynamic of these are people who are paid a lot, but scaled up from a McDonald's worker, making money for their boss at McDonald's, right? What is the discrepancy there? And then think about how big money sports are. And ultimately realize that this sort of argument gets you nowhere because it plays directly into the hands of the bosses who own so much capital and have so much influence on a media class that's designed to keep workers down, is designed to atomize working class people from each other, right? We can have the conversation about redistribution, but the question isn't should athletes be paid less? The question is maybe all workers should be paid exponentially more, right?
Totally. Yeah, totally. Well said. And I think that there's definitely wisdom in the idea of trying to make the working class as inclusive and holistic as humanly possible, and to draw clear demarcations between us and them, between workers and the bosses. So where are we at this moment? What's come of the NBA Wildcat Strike?
So this is where it gets a little fucky.
Just a
right?
little fucky.
Because there is a power imbalance within the league. And we are in the league of player empowerment, but some players are more empowered than others, right? No one is more indicative of this than LeBron James. LeBron James, who has essentially... he holds an immense amount of power because he is the face of the league. He is obviously the most well-compensated athlete. He is a cultural icon, right? Your mom who doesn't follow basketball knows who LeBron James is, right? He is a generational superstar. And LeBron James has a lot to lose if the league doesn't continue, right? And so LeBron James has a lot of leverage, and he also has a direct line to Obama, who he can And not to disparage James too much, right? He does believe in social justice. He does sort of understand, like, just from the perspective of being, you know, a black person in America, does understand the need for racial justice. Like, I'm not disparaging that, right? But, like, you know, he also is very close to a professional class that, you know, has its own interests at heart. And, like, you know, there was a union meeting with the NBA players where a lot of things were said, and LeBron James stormed out, and his entire team stormed out with him. And then the Clippers, who have one of the other most powerful teams, also from LA, you know, see a pattern here, reactionary city. Kidding, I love LA, but, like, you know, also stormed out. And the only person left from the LA was Dwight Howard, who then went on CNN to say capitalism and racism are interlinked. Absolute king. But, like, yeah, like James, you know, has the ear of Obama, and Obama has his ear, and Obama actually was the person who said, you should resume play and negotiate out a settlement here, and, like, you know, don't be too combative, right? You want to work with the owners, not alienate them, and stuff like that. And Barack Obama was the person who convinced LeBron James to end the strike.
Great, awesome, very cool.
So that just shows you where Obama's at, right?
Shows you exactly what comes of liberalism. As the meme goes, thanks Obama.
Yeah, literally, thanks Obama. But, you know, people see this as an enormous loss, and I fundamentally disagree with that. The NBA did extract some concessions, and they also asserted their power as workers, right? I think that is, because remember, there were concessions extracted at the beginning of the bubble that weren't good enough, and there were a second round of concessions extracted that, you know, led to establishment of social justice coalition, coaches focusing on voting access, you know, a lot of time and energy dedicated towards advocating and lobbying for civic engagement, criminal justice reform, and the use of NBA arenas as voting locations, which is going to be particularly cool for the Toronto Raptors, because that's where we can all cast our fake ballots under the names of dead Americans. But, like, that part was a joke. I don't actually intend to do voter fraud, but, like, and more of a focus on social justice. And, like, what the media did not cover, actually, was that a lot of players are still unhappy with this, right? Like, a lot of players have still expressed discontent with this. And so, like, yeah, on one hand, it's the players did get rolled. I don't think that's you know, arguable. They did get rolled by LeBron James, by Obama, literally by Obama. I can't believe that's a fucking thing that happened, but, like, you know, literally by Obama. I guess he had money riding on the Lakers series or something, but, like,
can you imagine?
But
just hold on. Can we just pause for 2 seconds? Imagine fucking Barack Obama gambling money on the Lakers just for shits and gigs. Like, you know, just that's such an image.
I wish I could do an Obama voice.
I was just thinking the same thing. I wish I could, but
let me be clear. But, like, you know, like,
holy shit.
But yeah, like, that's I think something worth considering within all of this is, like, it's important not to see labor actions like this as an end, but like a beginning, right? Like, the players, now everyone knows the player empowerment era is fucking here, right? People are saying it was here before. No, it's here. And the players have all the fucking power, right? And, like, one round of concessions was extracted, wasn't enough. There's a second round of concessions extracted, wasn't, you know, to a lot of people, it wasn't good enough. I'm not saying there's going to be a third strike in the bubble, right? That would be premature and probably unrealistic to conceive of. But what happens when, you know, if Biden wins in November and police brutality still is happening, right?
Oh, it will. That is precisely what's going to happen.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's not even a question, right? It's not even conjecture. But, like, you know, also consider who was leading this strike, right? It wasn't LeBron James. He was angry. Like, he had a specific bone to pick because he wasn't consulted, right? He felt personally slighted by this. LeBron James is 35 years old. He's in the back end of his career, and he's still, you know, a remarkable and incredible player. He's still, you know, easy top 2 or top 3 in the league. That's not even questionable, but he's 35 years old, right? This strike was led by young guys. This strike was led by young superstars, by young, you know, just players and stuff like that. not even superstars, who represent the future of the league, right? So you have to consider, like, where LeBron James is coming from is not where the strike originated, right? He was maybe collaborating with management in a space where other players weren't. But you really have to, as with all labor actions, you really do have to look at the long game of this and the long-term implications of this and the long-term ramifications of this. CBA contract negotiations are opening up, right? That's huge. You've got a dispute within the labor union from a more like center-leaning Chris Paul, who's the president of the union, and who's like, big everyone get up and vote guy, versus Kyrie Irving, who maybe articulates himself poorly sometimes. The earth is flat, whatever, but is still a lot more radical in terms of the politics he espouses, relative to like the conditions players have to operate in, right? And you have to think about like, well, how's this going to affect the CBA negotiations with the contract shrinking? How's this going to affect player relations with management moving forward? And management, as always, in the bottom end of this, right? Like they hold very little leverage right now, and I think that's super crucial to understand because their moneymaker is the NBA, obviously. Yeah, right.
I mean that is definitely their cash cow, and it's interesting too, Abdul, thinking about where the strike went and what lessons we can take with it as anti-racist organizers or as labor organizers ourselves listening to this podcast or you and me just talking about it, because I want to close talking about intersectionality, right? This Wildcat Strike came at a very crucial juncture. We see this type of concerted action happening in the midst of COVID-19 when players in a predominantly black league are being asked to play a sport to titillate and entertain while people of color are being gunned down indiscriminately in the streets by the police inside of this bubble where they are confined from the rest of the world and can't see their families, etc. And I'm kind of thinking about like what lessons can we learn from this particular strike. You talked a lot about time and how much how important it is to think about the crucial moments and having the right moment. And it seems to me increasingly that people are saying, a lot of people are saying increasingly it's the moment for a general strike. And I'm curious what you think about, the prospect of a general strike. I see a lot of naysayers on the internet because, of course, the internet is filled with naysayers. But, like, what can we learn from this NBA Wildcat Strike and what lessons can we take back to our own organizing?
It's important to consider a timeline, and I think it's important to consider. And I'm someone who, for most of my life has worked in a heavily unionized industry, the film industry, and has moved into working for a labor union and is now moving back into working into another sector of a heavily unionized industry, right? I'm very privileged to have been in union environments basically my entire working life, and I do have a bit of insight into this, and I've been on, many, many picket lines in my life, right? And worked very closely, on the shop floor with workers who have gone on strike. And I think it's a couple of, I know it's business unionism, not real unionism, whatever. That's, probably true, but you never heard me say it. I think a couple of the things worth considering in this case are time is of the essence with a strike, right? From first contract to strike, through negotiations, through escalating tactics, right? Like it was one shop floor action by one person, Colin Kaepernick, 4 years ago, that was built on the back of protests that have existed historically since 1996. If you look at Muhammad Abdul Rauf, or even before that in '68, right? Like that led to 4 years later a general strike that, and it's important, a general strike that started in the NBA sector wide, and then went to the MLB the same day, and the WNBA, obviously, bless them, they're far more fucking radical than any of the other leagues, and also Major League Soccer, and then the NBA shut down the league voluntarily the day after, or not the NBA, the NHL shut down the league the day after voluntarily, right? And it's important to consider, when you're organizing for a general strike, what you're really looking for is it's a combination of time, effort, and opportunity, right? And you'll know when the opportunity comes, and if you force the opportunity, it's going to be a fucking failure. Look at how many times in the Trump administration we've seen, like, general strike on this day, everyone just don't show up to work, and, like, no one does it, right? There's no actual organizing happening. It's a fucking social media psyop to get people fired. And, like, you can't skip the work, right? And, like, that's what players were doing behind the scenes, is they were doing the work without realizing it. They were having those difficult conversations, right? And, like, I think it fundamentally underscores the idea that racial justice, more than a representative issue, more than, just a simple, like social, scare quotes issue, like I'm not a class reductionist, is ultimately an economic and labor issue, right? It's ultimately the expression of a specifically underserved class of people that are additionally seen as subhuman by a white supremacist state, right? That both economically and socially disenfranchises them. And when we talk about intersectionality, that's really what we mean, is that, like, working class black people and working class white people have more in common than they don't, but at the same time, like, working class black people are still going to get shot by a cop, 9 times out of 10 more than a working class white person, right? I think it really underscores, like, the fact that you can't also be patronizing to the people you're organizing, or rely on you coming in from the outside as an organizer to save them, right? You're coming in to facilitate and help progress something that people already implicitly know and push back against. But people saying this is the right time for a general strike is premature, right? Because, like, where's your sector-wide organizing at the key points that will shut down America, right? Where's your organizing that's going to shut down trucking, right? The backbone of American economy. You're going to shut down trucking. You're going to shut down the ports. You're going to shut down major league sports, which I think are essential in terms of keeping people, like, getting people to stand up and listen, right? Like, when you talked about the Virginia Teachers Wildcat, right? Like, you and I know a lot about that because we're terminally online, but I think a lot of the people reacting to the player strike couldn't even remember that was the thing that happened, right? And it's like, you really have to know your key targets, and you really have to know the key time, and you really have to understand what your flashpoint is. There's a great saying in America that I can't remember. I interviewed him for an article once, but he told me, in regards to his organizing with Clayton Thomas Mueller, the eminent and incredible Clayton Thomas Mueller from Canada, had this piece in an article I wrote where he said, when talking about Indigenous action, he said the settler state of Canada, of so-called Canada, can only handle 14 flashpoints at any given time, right? Anything more than that, and the infrastructure of the state begins to crumble. And it's like, when you talk about general strike, you can't say, oh, everyone's just walking out on the street today and is walking out, and, like, that's it, right? You have to be like, you have to understand what your flashpoint is, and you have to do the organizing so that everyone on the shop floor in that sector understands, oh, this is the point where we walk off, right? And a lot of times that's your boss, in a shop floor saying, not negotiating anymore, that you take it or leave it. And that's where everyone knows strike vote time, right? But sometimes it's more organic, like what happened here. Sometimes it's not quite as organized as that. Like, you'll know when it happens, and you'll know because you've done the work to create that opportunity that you can then seize, right? And I think this is where a lot of people just have a bad understanding of what organizing means. It means going out into the streets and building power. And these players have shown everyone what that looks like, and have built the most, like, fuck how it ended, right? But, like, when you look at the process that got here, when you look at those conversations, when you look at the action and and the flashpoint that precipitated that action, it's like these players have just shown everyone who's wanted a general strike or a general wildcat how to do it. And I think that's so important, 100%. Right? It's worth considering that, Yeah, I think it's super important and super key to sort of think about it on those terms.
I couldn't agree more. Well, I think that's a beautiful note to leave it on, Abdul. Thank you so much again, King, for coming on Coffee with Comrades.
Thank you, King. Yes.
Hey, before I let you go, can you let folks know where they can go to follow you and stay up to date with you and with your journalism online?
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a couple of things to plug, if that's okay.
Yeah, please do, by all means.
You can listen to the podcast I'm currently on extended hiatus from, Kino Lefter, at Kino Lefter on Twitter. Evan has done a remarkable job being the only host of that podcast now. And while I'm sure he feels a little lonely, he's doing that job spectacularly. And,
For
and
sure.
the show
Big
is
shout outs
amazing.
to Evan. He's killing it.
Yeah, he is. You can follow me on Twitter at Socialist Raptor. I'm a huge Raptors fan. And I do journalism. I just had a piece today about, the social democracy and neoliberal capture in Canada, and a couple of other pieces. I think I have a piece about MMT coming out in the next couple of weeks. But more importantly than that, if you follow me on Twitter, you can follow my screenwriting career, which is popping off. I have my first studio feature film coming out likely next year, now that COVID has happened. It's in post-production right now. Gonna be honest, it's a career starter, not a magnum opus by any stretch of the imagination. I would never watch it, but my dad would love it. When it does come out, I'd love to come on and talk about what it means to make neoliberal cinema as a leftist, right? As a way to build your career or whatever. But and the dissonance within that. But yeah, you can keep appraised of my life in the film industry and how that's progressing through my Twitter feed. And I do have a feature film coming to either a large streaming service I cannot name or theaters, based on who picks it up and who ends up getting the distribution rights. But it's really cool. It's actually I can only speak to myself from a place of economic privilege, but that is an awesome thing to have happen. I feel very lucky, and hopefully it's the first thing of many. But thank you so much for having me on, King. I will never not pass up an opportunity to talk about sports.
Yeah, well, it's always a pleasure talking with you, my friend. I'm glad that we can make it work, and I'm glad that we could celebrate 100 episodes of Coffee with Comrades together. It's kind of
me too.
It's a wild ride. I'm glad that you were able to join me for it. It's a cool opportunity.
I'm also going to quickly do a plea to your listeners that you should definitely follow. You should definitely follow what Maya Moore in the NBA is doing. She's left. She's a superstar who skipped 2 seasons now to work on the case of someone who has been Jonathan Irons, who's been falsely accused and imprisoned for life on a robbery and assault charge, a black man. And also, if you're a leftist, either smoke or follow a single major league sport, because you will never have a better inroad to building connections with your coworkers and other people through one of those 2 things.
That's the truest advice I've ever heard.
Yeah, it's one or the other. It doesn't have to be both, but just follow a sport or smoke, because you will have great conversations that will endear you to people, and there will be genuine conversations, because people fucking care about this. I know it's hard to fathom, but people do, right?
Yeah, for sure. For fucking sure. Well, Abdul, I hope you have a great rest of your night, my friend.
You too. Bye.
Bye.
What's up, Piers? This is Murdoch here, and from the cold north. And here comes my 3 questions. So, when did you become an anarchist?
Murdoch, what's good, buddy? I first became an anarchist Well, I guess you could kind of say that I've always been an anarchist, at least in like theory and praxis. Well, maybe not praxis, but definitely in theory. I didn't really understand the language for it until I read V for Vendetta by Alan Moore and was like, oh, V is an anarchist. That kind of sounds like what I want. And of course, it's not. It's obviously like a highly fictionalized comic book superhero story. But it definitely kind of gave me the language with which to describe my political views. And as time went on, gradually I started to kind of read more, and I read Noam Chomsky, I read Murray Bookchin, I read Emma Goldman, I read Kropotkin, I read Bakunin, and Malatesta, Parsons, the list goes on, Berkman, and eventually I was like, oh, okay, so these are like the actual like theorists who have contributed vast, troves of knowledge to the idea of what anarchism is. And I think that as I've gotten older, like I'm more reticent to just be like, especially in like lefty circles, like just be like, yes, I am this particular thing, because as I've said and enumerated on the show countless times, I think that it's maybe it's unproductive to just try and label everybody, because what ends up happening is we get these reductive images in our minds of what people are. That's at least been my personal experience. Maybe it's different in bigger cities, maybe it's different in different countries, but to me it seems that we are at our strongest when we build coalitions and work together around things that we can agree upon, and struggle towards building dual power in the here and now in order to prefigure a better world in the shell of the old.
Second question, do you speak any other languages?
Unfortunately, I do not speak any languages. I'm an ignorant swine, and I wish that I could. I can read French given a given a lot of time and a dictionary, or translation dictionary, but generally speaking, I am uncultured swine.
And third, and the most important question of them all, is why is KOTOR the best game ever? Because that is debatable, but it's a really good game. I really want to know why.
Okay, so KOTOR, or Knights of the Old Republic, is hands down the best game ever made, and I'm gonna tell you why. Okay, so first of all, well, it's hard to get into it without making spoilers, because if you haven't played it, then tune out for the next like minute and a half. So Knights of the Republic is a Star Wars game, if you've been living under a rock or if you're not a nerdy ass video gamer like me, and it centers around a really narrative driven character drama where you get to play as a person who has lost their memories, and you go through the game over and over and over and over, trying to either do the light side or the dark side. And then there's this huge like twist at the end of the game where you find out that you are secretly a Sith Lord who has had their memories removed by the Force, and you can either choose to essentially reclaim your proper place as the Lord of the Sith, or you can revoke that and seek to, chase the light. You can also even be like a neutral gray Jedi throughout the game as well, and kind of dip into both light side and dark side powers. It's a very narrative driven game. It's got a lot of really beautiful like characterization and voice acting. It's obviously like really old now, so it doesn't like play super well, but it's incredible, and everyone should play it because it's the best game ever made.
And also, I wanted to thank you for this amazing podcast you're having, and I really understand. It makes my day so much better and joyful when I tilt the garden at work, and I listen to all the hopeful voices, and just brings me courage and overall militant joy. So thanks, comrade, and have an amazing day. And see ya.
Hello everyone, my name is Pia, and I think I'm a pretty new listener to this podcast, discovering it through Rev Left Radio some time ago. Luckily. I'm from Germany, and this directly ties into my question because I have the impression that here the most prominent argument in conversations about racism or police brutality is that it's worse in the United States. So my question is something like how one could point out problems in our capitalist society if they are not extremely obvious or concerning right now. So like, how can you argue against this, oh, it's worse somewhere else, so we're fine here, mindset? Like, when fascism is capitalism in decay, how can we intervene before it's so bad? I'm really interested in your opinion about this.
So I think that anti-Black racism and white supremacy are necessarily baked into much of the colonizing nations. And I think that from what I understand, a lot of European nations like to sort of thumb their noses at the United States, and, you know, for good reason, considering the fact that the United States is currently the sort of imperial core, and it is a country that is steeped in a long legacy of genocide and of ethnic cleansing and of chattel slavery. But at the same time, I think that racism is a worldwide phenomenon, and it is not something that is relegated to one state or one country. Moreover, I think it's also important to recognize that the European countries were the primary colonizers of the world, and that, you know, that obviously holds true for you know, the United States, which was initially a British colony. And then finally, you know, I think perhaps most importantly, we can't divorce fascism from the very specific context in which it arose in the modern era in Spain and in Italy and in Germany. And I think that it is foolish to suggest that, you know, these countries are somehow immune to that line you quoted from Lenin, that capitalism is or fascism is capitalism in decay. And I don't know if actually he said it or someone else said it. I've heard people say that it's misattributed to Lenin, and that perhaps Zizek said it or somebody else said it. I don't know. Who cares? It's a good fucking line, and I don't really care who said it all that much. Regardless, I think there's something to be said for how we organize in the here and now to try and prevent it. And I think that, unfortunately, the advice that I would have is not especially comforting. I don't think there's much that we can do to stop it. I think that, unfortunately, capitalism has congealed very specific conditions, and it is going to exacerbate those material conditions to the detriment of working people, and especially to the detriment of poor and indigenous and people of color. And I think that, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to escape the collapse of capitalism at this point. I think we are too far gone, and I think that the ruling class has made it abundantly clear that they are totally disinterested in disbanding or dismantling their current power structures, and that at this point the only thing that we can really do is either A, seize like a revolutionary moment, which seems less and less likely by the day, save in like specific pockets, not like a global revolution, but in like different pockets of resistance, or B, be prepared for the collapse and be prepared to carve out spaces for autonomy and for liberty and for equality, rather than waiting and dreaming for that to happen. We should begin the hard work of building it in the here and the now. We should garden. We should work towards trying to build community self-defense. We should create educational institutions that are outside of and against the prevailing institutions. We should try and protect our comrades of color, etc. And I think that this is going to increasingly be a nexus of struggle in the years and decades ahead, and all we can do is prepare for it now and prefigure the type of world that we want to live in.
Hey Pearson, this is Jonathan. I want to thank you first and foremost for providing a safe and comfortable space for me and so many others to learn about topics and lifestyles and choices and activism that we all need so much in this world. My question for you and whoever is going to be on the Q&A is, when confronted with family who may or may not be some level of conservative, whether aggressively so or more moderate to conservative, what has been the single most helpful tool in disarming and or confronting those people in those conversations, as they can get very heated very quickly? If that's something that you relate to or have experienced, I would love some tips and your insight. Thank you again. Take care.
So I kind of lucked out, and I have family who are generally pretty understanding. I mean, we don't see eye to eye on much, but they're very understanding and accepting and lovely and wonderful, and I appreciate them immensely. I do have more conservative friends. Specifically, I have friends who like to refer to themselves as libertarians, but anyone who understands the sort of libertarian right in the United States knows that they're not really interested in liberty or individual freedom as much as they profess as freedom for the market and freedom for the boss, which is not being a libertarian. It's called being a propertarian, but that's neither here nor there. The point being, when you find yourself in a situation where you're getting into a discussion with someone who doesn't see eye to eye to you, the first thing that I try to determine is whether or not we are having a good faith conversation or if we are having a debate. Because to me, having a good faith conversation is enjoyable, it's edifying, it's thought-provoking, it's engaging, it's dynamic, and it is it's capable of allowing you as an individual to explore your own ideas and convictions without having the pressure of having someone try and tell you that you're wrong and that you need to change your perspective, or B, doing that to someone else. A debate, on the other hand, is really steeped in this sort of liberal mythos of, being able to pwn somebody else or being able to dominate the conversation or to use clever rhetoric in order to persuade an audience. And I think debate is essentially one of the dumbest things that human beings have contrived. It is reductive and vacuous at its best, and it is polemic and actively harmful at its worst. And if you find that you're having a debate with someone, I would recommend just stopping and especially if it's a friend or a family member, just being like, hey, I love you. I don't want to have this conversation with you. I don't see how it would be productive, and it's making me irritated. And just being honest and transparent with people. And sometimes people are cool with that, and then other times people really want to keep pushing you. And it really just depends on, your personal, your personal kind of convictions about, like, how much you want to push back, how much you think is necessary. I would just encourage anyone who's in that situation to kind of look and see, like, is this a lost cause? Is this even worth, having a conversation about it? Or am I literally just wasting my breath? And that is a calculus that I think is different and contingent upon the given situation in which you find yourself. Now, I also at the same time think it's really important to be able to defend your position and defend your ideas. But I think that comes not from debate or argument, but rather from vigorous analysis and critical thinking and a careful weighing and measuring of the evidence. Because 9 times out of 10, what ends up happening in a debate is it divulges into hyperbole and into exaggeration. People end up reaching for the most ridiculous and fatuous kind of idea possible and create these straw man arguments that you are then supposed to argue against. For example, when people say communism is responsible for killing 6 million people, right? That is obviously clearly a huge straw man argument that you have to dismantle by saying, okay, communism is not the USSR. Communism is a very specific, economic and political program. Shouldn't surprise anyone that I have my own criticisms of the USSR, which is what I would then, share with them. And then from there, go on to say that capitalism is responsible for killing countless millions. It's literally impossible to calculate how many millions of people have died because of capitalism. And so instead of thinking about, this very narrow paradigm of the USSR equaling communism, perhaps we should do the more laborious but also more rewarding work of looking at these things as larger systems and how they either can go right or go wrong. And I think that, having those kinds of casual, intimate and personal conversations with people who are willing to listen and willing to respect, like genuinely respect, like a diversity of opinion, I think is great. I think that, however, there is absolutely no room for having those types of conversations with fascists or with racists. I don't think that those kinds of conversations are even worth entertaining in the first place. So again, it's all kind of contingent upon the given material conditions in which you might find yourself. And I hope that helps anyone who's been in that situation, because God knows I have more times than I can count.
And that about does it for this week's episode of Coffee with Comrades. This is an entirely DIY show run by workers for workers. If you like what you hear, you can follow us on Twitter at CoffeeWComrades and Instagram at CoffeeWithComrades. Check out our website, www.coffeewithcomrades.com, and sign up to support our work with a monthly contribution by going to www.patreon.com/coffeewithcomrades. You can find Coffee with Comrades on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, wherever you go to get your anti-capitalist propaganda. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. While you're there, smashing that subscribe button, be sure to rate and review the show as well to help us increase our reach. If you have feedback, criticism, or you'd just like to get in touch with us, shoot us an email at coffeewithcomrades@gmail.com. Until next time, stay wild out there, comrades.
Through the city
Thank you, King.
Have I mentioned before that I love that you call everyone unironically King, even though you are a libertarian
Absolutely.
socialist? It's so fucking funny to me.
It's what is it? I call all my friends King and Queen because not because I as a term of endearment, but because I think they should be tried in a kangaroo court in 13th century in 16th century France. No, it's I don't know where it came from. I think it was just something that like me and my friends did in university, and I just never left.